Wilson had never planned to fall in love in Seoul. He had planned to study, save money, and go back to Atlanta with a business degree and a better future. But life has a funny way of giving you things you never planned for. Every morning Wilson woke up before the sun did. He would roll off his small mattress in his rented room, pull on his work clothes, usually dark jeans and a plain t-shirt, tie his green floral apron around his waist, and walk 15 minutes to the flower shop where he worked. The shop was called Petal and Thread, a tiny warm little place squeezed between a convenience store and a noodle restaurant on a side street in Mapo, Seoul. Wilson loved that shop with his whole heart. He loved the way it smelled first thing in the morning, like rain and sweetness mixed together. He loved arranging the buckets of fresh flowers by color and size before customers arrived. He loved the way people's faces changed when they walked through the door. Stressed people softened. Sad people smiled a little. Tired people stood still for just a moment, like the flowers reminded them that something in the world was still beautiful. That feeling, making people feel better just by being around something good, was the reason Wilson had chosen to work here while studying. It was not the best-paying job. It was not glamorous. But it was honest and it made him happy, and Wilson believed that if you could find something honest that made you happy, you were already ahead of most people. His boss, a small older Korean woman named Mrs. Park, trusted him completely after just 3 weeks. She let him design the window displays, handle the morning deliveries, and manage the register on busy days. Wilson had learned enough Korean to joke with the regular customers and enough patience to deal with the ones who changed their orders 5 times before deciding. He was saving money slowly. Night school was expensive and Seoul was not a cheap city. His room was small. His meals were simple, mostly rice, eggs, and whatever vegetables were on sale. He video called his mother in Atlanta every Sunday and told her things were going great, even on the weeks when they were just okay. But Wilson was genuinely happy. Not the kind of happy that needs big things to hold it up. The quiet kind, the kind that lives in small moments. A perfect flower arrangement. A customer who comes back just to say thank you. A warm cup of coffee in the middle of a slow afternoon. He had built a small, steady life for himself and he was proud of it. He did not know that on a rainy Tuesday morning, a black car was going to pull up outside his shop and change absolutely everything. He did not know that a man in a gray suit was about to walk through his door and, without either of them meaning to, start something that would turn both their worlds completely upside down. Wilson was arranging a bucket of white roses near the front window when the rain started coming down hard. He watched the street outside blur with water and umbrellas and hurrying people, humming quietly to himself, completely at peace. He had no idea what was coming. Across the city, in a tall glass building with floor-to-ceiling windows, Diyun is sitting at his enormous desk. It is midnight. He has been in back-to-back meetings since 7 in the morning. His tie is still perfectly straight. His face shows nothing, no tiredness, no feelings, nothing. His assistant left hours ago. The office is the kind of room that was designed to make people feel small. The desk is black marble. The chair behind it costs more than most people's cars. The walls on 2 sides are nothing but glass, and through them the city spreads out in every direction. A million lights blinking below like they are all reporting to him, which in a way many of them are. Diyun does not look at the view. He never looks at the view. It is just the city. He has had the city for years. It stopped being impressive somewhere around the time he turned 28 and realized that having power over something does not make that thing interesting. There are files open on his desk. Reports. Numbers. 3 contracts waiting for his signature. He has read each of them twice. His pen sits at a precise angle beside them. Not carelessly placed but put there deliberately, the way Diyun does everything. He does not do anything carelessly. Carelessness is how people get hurt, and Diyun decided a long time ago that nothing and no one would be able to hurt him. He is very good at this. The people who work for him say he has no emotions. His rivals say he has no heart. His mother, in the one phone call they have per month, says he works too hard, and he says I'm fine and she says you always say that, and they move on because neither of them has ever found a better path through that particular conversation. His personal phone sits at the top right corner of the desk. It almost never buzzes. The 4 people who have this number know better than to contact him past 10 unless the building is on fire. It buzzes. Diyun picks it up without urgency. He reads the message once. His expression does not change. He reads it again. Jerome, I'm starving, bro. Like actually starving. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. I need your touch right now. Just bring me some rice or something please, I'm begging you. He sets the phone down. He picks it up again. The word starving sits in the middle of the message like it knows it does not belong on his phone and is daring him to ignore it anyway. Diyun has received messages on this phone about shipments worth 8 figures. He has received coded warnings that meant people were in danger. He has received exactly one birthday message from his assistant, who sent it by accident and apologized 3 times the next morning. He has never received a message asking for rice. He is a man who controls hundreds of people, coordinates entire systems, makes decisions before breakfast that other people won't understand for months. And sitting here at midnight with the city quiet below him, he finds that he cannot simply delete a message from someone who is hungry and does not know they texted the wrong person. Something in his chest does something he does not immediately have a name for. He types back 2 words, "Who is this?" Then he sets the phone down again, folds his hands and waits. Which is something Diyun is very good at. Waiting. Watching. Being still while everything around him moves. What he is not prepared for is that the answer, when it eventually comes, will change every calculation he has made about his own life. He doesn't know that yet. Right now he just knows the city is quiet and someone somewhere is hungry, and his phone, for the first time in a very long time, has said something that felt human. He came back the next morning at the same time, 8:47 a.m., almost exactly. Same gray suit, different tie. Same unreadable expression. Same request, white roses. Wilson, who had spent the previous evening wondering if the card-leaving, suit-soaking, ghost-smiling man was going to complain to his boss or never come back at all, was so surprised to see him that he nearly knocked over a bucket of sunflowers. "You came back," Wilson said before he could stop himself. "I need white roses," Hyun said. "Right. Yes. Of course." Wilson turned quickly to the display. "Same arrangement as yesterday, or smaller?" "1 bunch." Wilson wrapped a single bunch of white roses with hands that were slightly less steady than usual, tied the ribbon carefully and held them out. Hyun paid. Exact price this time, no triple. He turned to go. "Same event?" Wilson asked. He didn't know why he asked. It just came out. Hyun paused at the door. A pause so brief that Wilson almost thought he imagined it. "No," Hyun said. Then he left. He came back the morning after that. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. By the end of the first week, Wilson had stopped being surprised. He started having the white roses ready near the front by 8:40, wrapped loosely so Hyun could choose the ribbon color. Hyun always picked white ribbon. Wilson started to suspect Hyun would pick white ribbon if offered every color in the rainbow, so on the 5th day he laid out only a yellow one just to see what would happen. Hyun looked at the yellow ribbon for a long moment. Then he looked at Wilson. Wilson grinned. "We're out of white." Hyun picked up the yellow ribbon and turned it over once in his fingers, expression completely flat. "This is acceptable," he said and held it out for Wilson to tie. Wilson tied it while trying very hard not to laugh. That was the day the conversation started, small ones at first. Hyun would say something minimal and factual. Wilson would respond with something warm and slightly too honest. Hyun would look at him in that slow, examining way, like Wilson was a problem he was trying to solve. But he always stayed a little longer than necessary before leaving. By the 2nd week, Wilson had learned that Hyun took his coffee black, had never owned a plant, and thought small talk was a waste of time. Hyun had learned that Wilson was from Atlanta studying business, and had once accidentally given a customer a funeral arrangement for a birthday party because he mixed up 2 orders. That last one made Hyun go very still for a moment before exhaling through his nose in a sound that was, Wilson was almost certain, a suppressed laugh. "That is unfortunate," Hyun said. "The customer cried," Wilson said. "From grief?" "From laughing. Eventually. It took a while." Hyun looked at him for a long moment. That small movement at the corner of his mouth happened again, stronger this time, almost visible. "You are strange," he said. "Thank you," Wilson said cheerfully. Hyun left. But the next morning he was there at 8:44, 3 minutes earlier than usual. Wilson noticed. He did not say anything about it. But he noticed. What Wilson could not have known, what Hyun would not have been able to explain to anyone including himself, was that these 15 minutes in a small flower shop on a side street in Mapo had become the only part of Hyun's day that felt like breathing. It was exactly 14 days after the bouquet accident when Hyun did not leave after buying his roses. Wilson had handed over the white bunch, taken the payment, given the usual smile, and then noticed that Hyun was still standing at the counter. Not moving toward the door. Just standing there, looking at the roses in his hand with an expression that, on any other face, Wilson might have described as uncertain. On Hyun's face, it looked more like a man doing a very complex calculation. "Did I get the ribbon wrong again?" Wilson asked. "No. Hyun set the roses down on the counter. He looked at Wilson directly. "Have dinner with me." Wilson blinked. "Sorry? Tonight. Dinner." A brief pause. "With me." It was not a question technically. But something about the slight stiffness in Hyun's shoulders, the almost imperceptible way his jaw was set just a fraction tighter than usual, told Wilson that this was, in fact, the most uncertain Hyun Moon had been about anything in a very long time. Wilson looked at him for a moment. The serious face. The expensive suit. The black business card he had kept in his apron pocket for 2 weeks without fully understanding why. "Okay," Wilson said. Something shifted in Hyun's expression. Not dramatically, not the way it would on someone more used to showing things. Just a small settling like a weight had moved. "I will send a car at 7, Hyun said. He picked up his roses and walked out. Wilson stood at the counter for a solid 10 seconds after the door closed. Then he pulled out his phone and texted his mother in Atlanta. "Mom. Something happened. I'll call Sunday. Don't panic." The restaurant Hyun chose was the kind of place that did not have a menu on the wall or prices on a card. A quiet man in a dark suit led Wilson to a private room where Hyun was already seated, jacket still perfect, expression still composed. The evening started stiff. Hyun ordered for both of them in Korean before Wilson could say anything, then looked slightly guilty about it and asked quietly if Wilson had any dietary restrictions. It was such an unexpectedly considerate question from a man who had just made every decision at the table that Wilson laughed out loud. Hyun looked startled. Like laughter in this room was a new element he had not accounted for. "You're nervous," Wilson said. "I am not nervous," Hyun said. "You ordered for me and then immediately asked if you ordered wrong. That's nervous." Hyun was quiet for a moment. "I am not accustomed to this," he said finally. "To dinner?" "To," a pause. "To not knowing what I am doing." Wilson smiled at him, not the customer service smile, the real one. "That makes 2 of us," he said. "I've never had dinner with someone who arrived in a car that costs more than my college tuition." Hyun looked at him steadily. "Is that uncomfortable?" "Honestly? A little. But you're the one who's nervous, so I think we're okay." Hyun looked down at his water glass. That almost smile appeared again, and this time it stayed a second longer than it ever had before. They talked for 4 hours. The food was extraordinary and Wilson only pretended to know what half of it was. Hyun slowly and then all at once stopped being stiff. He did not transform into someone warm and easy, that was not who he was, but he became present in a way that felt rare and deliberate, like he was choosing, consciously, to actually be there. To actually listen. And Hyun Moon, who had sat across from presidents and criminals and everyone in between without feeling anything much, spent 4 hours listening to a 24-year-old flower shop worker from Atlanta talk about accidental funeral arrangements and the smell of roses in the morning, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The months that followed were the softest Hyun had ever lived through. He did not have a word for what was happening to him at first. He only knew that his 8:47 a.m. visits to Petal and Thread had become the anchor of his day. That he had started keeping his phone nearby even in meetings, something he had never done before, because Wilson sent voice messages that were sometimes 3 minutes long and always made him exhale in a way that loosened something in his chest. That he had learned what Wilson's different silences meant. The comfortable ones, the thinking ones, the ones that meant something was wrong but Wilson wasn't ready to say so yet. Hyun was not a man who had ever paid that kind of attention to another person. He paid attention to strategy, to risk, to the movements of people who wanted to take things from him. Personal attention, the soft, patient kind, was not part of how he had lived his life. Wilson changed that without even trying. For Wilson it was simpler to name. He was in love. He knew it by the 3rd month, felt it settle in him like something true and permanent. Hyun was not easy. He was quiet where Wilson was loud, guarded where Wilson was open, serious in a way that sometimes made Wilson work for every single laugh. But every laugh he earned felt like a prize. And beneath the expensive suits and the cold professional face was a person who was, Wilson had come to understand, simply unused to being cared for without agenda. So Wilson cared for him without agenda. He showed up with extra coffee on hard days. He remembered things Hyun mentioned once and never repeated. He did not push for information Hyun wasn't ready to give. And slowly, very slowly, Hyun gave it anyway. It started with small things. He told Wilson about growing up in a wealthy family with cold parents who treated success as the only love language. About building Moon Corp from an inherited foundation into something entirely his own. About the loneliness that lived inside power when there was no one you actually trusted. Then for months in Hyun told Wilson the rest. He told him about the underground. About what Moon Corp really was beneath its polished surface. He told it carefully and completely, watching Wilson's face the whole time. Wilson was quiet for a long time afterward. "Are you going to leave?" Hyun asked. His voice was even. But his hands, flat on the table, were very still in the way they got when he was bracing. "I'm thinking," Wilson said. He thought for a while longer. Then he said, "Have you ever hurt someone who didn't deserve it?" "Yes," Hyun said. No hesitation. No excuse. Wilson nodded slowly. "Are you honest with me?" "Always." Another long pause. Then Wilson reached across the table and put his hand over Hyun's still one. "Then I'm staying," he said. "But if that ever changes, if you ever stop being honest, that's when I'm done." Hyun looked at his hand for a moment. Then he turned it over and held Wilson's hand properly. "It will not change," he said. Life became warmer, larger, fuller. Hyun moved Wilson to a better apartment. He paid Wilson's school fees without making it feel like charity. He simply said, "You should not have to work 3 jobs and study. Pick 2. Wilson kept the flower shop and school. His pride required it. Hyun respected that completely. They were happy. Genuinely, quietly, solidly happy. Neither of them noticed that someone was watching all of this with cold, growing fury. Rio had been Hyun's right-hand man for 10 years. He was 28, handsome, charming in a surface way, with a smile that never fully reached his tan-skinned cheeks. He had spent a decade telling himself that his feelings for Hyun were simply deep loyalty. He had built his entire sense of importance around being the person Hyun relied on most. And then Wilson had walked in, smiling, easy, taking up space in Hyun's world like he had always belonged there, and everything Rio had told himself began to feel very hollow indeed. He said nothing. He smiled his smooth smile and shook Wilson's hand warmly when they were introduced. He acted like a friend. He acted like he was happy for them both. But behind that face he was already planning. Rio was patient. That was his greatest skill, not strength, not intelligence, but patience. The ability to smile and wait and move so slowly that no one ever felt him coming. He started with Wilson the way all good traps start, with kindness. It was easy at first because Wilson was naturally open. Wilson liked people, trusted people, believed in the basic goodness of people until shown otherwise. Rio understood this within 20 minutes of spending real time with him and adjusted accordingly. He did not try to be impressive or formal. He was warm, casual. He asked Wilson questions about Atlanta, about the flower shop, about what Korean food he had tried so far. He laughed at Wilson's stories. He offered to show him the good street food spots that tourists never found. Hyun, deep in a complicated business quarter, was busier than usual. There were weeks where he and Wilson saw each other only briefly, late evenings, quick mornings. Wilson understood. He did not complain. But the hours were long and Seoul was still a foreign city, and having someone easy and friendly to spend time with felt genuinely good. Rio was there for all of it. He took Wilson to a night market in Dongdaemun and laughed when Wilson tried to negotiate prices in broken Korean. He sat with him on a Han River bench one afternoon and listened, really listened or seemed to, while Wilson talked about feeling small sometimes in a city this big. He said things like, "Hyun is lucky to have someone like you," and "I've never seen him like this before. You're good for him," in ways that felt sincere and made Wilson trust him more. Piece by piece, Rio built something that looked exactly like friendship. Wilson texted Hyun one evening, "Your friend Rio is actually really fun. I'm glad I got to know him." Hyun replied, "Good. He is important to me." Wilson smiled at the message, happy that 2 people he cared about were getting along. He had no idea that he had just told Hyun the one thing that would make the coming trap more devastating. 2 months into this careful construction, Rio made his move. He contacted Wilson using a message thread that looked almost identical to the one Hyun used for sending logistics and schedule updates. A business line number Wilson had in his phone as H, office. Rio had a second SIM card loaded with a number 1 digit different. Wilson, who received most of Hyun's business-related messages through that line, did not look closely enough. The message said, "Change of plans. Need you to pick up an important business document from my associate at the Gangnam Coffee address below. He knows to expect you. 4 p.m. today." Wilson arrived at the coffee address at 4 o'clock. A man was waiting, someone Wilson did not recognize, someone Rio had paid to be there. They exchanged a few words. The man handed over a sealed envelope. Wilson tucked it under his arm and headed home, planning to drop it at Hyun's office on his way. Across the street, behind tinted glass, Rio raised his camera and took the photos he needed. Wilson leaving a meeting with a man who was, in fact, one of the key figures in a rival underground organization. Wilson accepting a package. Wilson walking away, looking from exactly the right angle, exactly like someone who had just completed a covert handoff. Rio looked at the photos on his screen. He smiled his smooth surface smile. The one that never reached his cheeks. Then he went to see Ha-yoon. The photos were printed. Rio had thought of everything. He brought them to Ha-yoon's private office at Moon Corp on a Thursday evening, when the building was mostly empty and Ha-yoon was finishing late work alone. Rio laid the photos on the desk carefully, not dramatically, not with urgency. Calmly. Like a man who was grieving something and doing his duty anyway. He had practiced this. I found something, Rio said. I didn't want to bring it to you. But I couldn't not. Ha-yoon looked at the photos. He was very still. In the photos, Wilson was clear and identifiable. The man he was meeting with was also identifiable, to Ha-yoon, immediately as someone connected to the Cheon organization, the rival faction that had been working against Moon Corp for 2 years. Wilson was accepting a package. Wilson was walking away. Ha-yoon's face did not change. It went somewhere colder than its usual coldness, somewhere deep and locked. When was this? Ha-yoon said. Rio told him a date and time that had a perfect, innocent explanation, but Ha-yoon did not know that. And Rio had made sure that on that same date, a piece of sensitive Moon Corp information had leaked to the Cheon side, seating the connection neatly. I'm sorry, Rio said. His voice was soft, carrying just the right weight of reluctance. I know how much he means to you. But you needed to know. Ha-yoon stared at the photos for a long time. The cold part of him, the part that had built an underground empire, the part that survived by trusting no one, the part that had spent 30 years learning that care was something people used against you, took over completely. He did not ask for Wilson's side. He did not call. He did not want to watch Wilson look at him and lie. He could not survive that. So he moved the way he always moved in his other world. Completely, immediately, without hesitation. He made 3 calls. The first ended Wilson's apartment lease. The second canceled the school payment arrangement. The third was to the security team, collect Wilson's belongings and have them outside the building by morning. Then he sent Wilson a single text from his personal number. Do not contact me again. He sat in his office for a long time after that. He did not move. He did not look at the photos again. He simply sat and let the locked part of him do what it had always done, hold everything down until nothing could get out. Rio, standing near the door with his perfectly grieving expression, watched him and felt, beneath it all, a cold and terrible satisfaction. Wilson was in his apartment when the text came through. He read it 3 times because it did not make sense. He called Ha-yoon's number. Blocked. He called the office line. Disconnected. He sent messages. Delivered. Never read. He went to the building entrance at midnight and found 2 men from Ha-yoon's team loading his boxes into the back of a van without speaking to him. When he tried to get past them to go upstairs, they blocked him, not roughly but completely. Wilson stood on the pavement in the cold and understood, very slowly, that something catastrophic had happened, and that he had no idea what or why. He sat down on the curb next to his boxes. And for the first time since he had arrived in Seoul, since he had built his small careful life, since he had let someone in, since he had given Ha-yoon Moon his honest heart, Wilson cried. The first 3 days were the worst. Wilson stayed in a cheap guest house near his night school because it was the only place he could afford on short notice and because he could not think far enough ahead to make a better plan. He ate very little. He slept in pieces. He kept his phone in his hand, checking it every few minutes, knowing there would be nothing there and checking anyway. He went over everything he could remember from the past weeks, searching for what he had done wrong. He could not find it. That was the part that broke something specific inside him, not just the loss but the complete absence of explanation. The wall that had gone up without warning, without reason he could see, without a single question asked. On the 4th day he put his phone face down on the guesthouse table and did not check it for 6 hours. On the 5th day he went back to Petal and Thread and asked Mrs. Park if he still had his job. She looked at him carefully, at the shadow under his eyes, the quiet that had replaced his usual energy, and said yes of course and made him a cup of tea without asking any questions. That act of small, uncomplicated kindness nearly broke him all over again. On the 6th day he met Dana. She was in his night school business class. He had seen her before but they had never spoken properly. She sat down next to him before the lecture started, looked at him with sharp direct almond eyes and said, "You look terrible. What happened?" Wilson blinked. "Nothing." "Okay," she said. "Then, you can tell me after class if you want. I have nowhere to be." He told her everything after class, sitting on the steps outside the school building in the cold, talking for an hour and a half while Dana listened with her knees pulled up to her chest and her expression serious and real, not pitying, not dramatic, just present. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's genuinely awful. I'm sorry." "Yeah," Wilson said. "You're not going to chase him, right? Every call is blocked." "Good. Don't find another way. You don't beg someone who didn't ask any questions." She paused. "What do you need right now?" Wilson thought about it honestly. "A room," he said. "And to feel like something isn't over." Dana had a spare room in her apartment. She offered it at a fair rate, no pressure. Wilson moved in 3 days later. He started working 3 jobs. Flower shop mornings. A cafe near school afternoons. Online tutoring evenings. He finished his business coursework with the kind of focused stubbornness that only real pain produces. He graduated his program on a cold Thursday morning with Dana in the front row taking photos on her phone. And then, in the small hours of a quiet weekend, sitting at Dana's kitchen table with a notebook and a pen and the particular clarity that comes from having lost something and survived it, Wilson started writing a business plan. He called it Still Blooming. A small online flower and curated gift delivery service. Built on the same idea that had made him love petal and thread, that flowers could change the feeling of a room, of a day, of a moment. That something beautiful and alive, given at the right time, could remind a person they were not alone. He built the website himself. He sourced wholesale suppliers. He launched quietly with no advertising, just Dana posting about it to her social media and Mrs. Park mentioning it to regulars. Within 3 months he had a steady client base. Within 6 he had enough to rent a small commercial space on a side street in Mapo, not far actually from where his story in Seoul had begun. He painted the shop front himself. He hung a simple sign. Still Blooming. Wilson stood in front of it on opening day, hands in his jacket pockets, and felt something settle in him. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But something solid. Something true. Something that was completely, entirely, unbreakably his. 3 months after Wilson disappeared from Ha-Yoon's life, Moon Corp began to bleed. It started small, the way serious damage usually does. A business deal in Incheon that collapsed at the final stage. A partner in Busan who suddenly became unavailable. Information that appeared, precisely and devastatingly, in the hands of the Cheon organization. Information that could only have come from deep inside Moon Corp's own structure. Ha-Yoon noticed the pattern within 2 weeks. He ran his world with the kind of methodical precision that came from years of operating where mistakes meant catastrophe. He could see the shape of it. Someone inside, someone trusted, someone with access to core operations, even if he could not yet see the face. He said nothing to anyone. He pulled his trust inward and waited. It was Mr. Shin who found the folder. Mr. Shin was 65 years old, a quiet man who had served Ha-Yoon's organization as a security guard and general keeper for 11 years. He was the kind of man who was invisible to people who thought importance wore expensive clothes. Small, weathered, moving through corridors and filing rooms and back offices without anyone paying him much attention. Ha-Yoon trusted him precisely because Rio and others like him had always overlooked him. Mr. Shin found the folder on a Tuesday night while doing a routine sweep of a rarely used office on the 14th floor. A room that had been Rio's private workspace before he had moved to the primary executive floor 3 years ago. The room had been cleared, supposedly. But behind a false panel in the back of a storage closet, Mr. Shin found things thorough, was a slim folder. Inside the folder were printed conversation records. Messages between Rio and a man named Cheon Ji-ho, the operational head of the rival organization. The messages went back 11 months. They detailed exactly what Rio had been doing, feeding information, manufacturing evidence, steering deals toward failure. They were systematic and thorough. There was also a short printed note in Rio's handwriting, not a message, just a private notation for himself. It read in Korean, "The flower boy is the cleanest angle. Untraceable back to me. Ha-Yoon won't ask questions. He never does when it's personal." Mr. Shin read this twice. Then he closed the folder, put it inside his jacket and walked to Ha-Yoon's office. He did not knock loudly. He tapped twice the way he always did and waited. Ha-Yoon looked up from his desk. He saw Mr. Shin's face and was still immediately, because Mr. Shin's face, always neutral, was carrying something heavy. "Sir," Mr. Shin said and placed the folder on the desk. Ha-Yoon opened it. He read everything. He read the handwritten note last. He did not move for a very long time. The office was silent except for the distant city below. Ha-Yoon sat in that silence and felt, beneath the locked professionalism and the cold precision and the years of trained stillness, something that was simply, devastatingly, grief. He had been a fool. Not because he had been deceived by a skilled, patient trader with 10 years of access to his world. That part he could process. That part was a professional failure, terrible and correctable. What he could not process as cleanly was this: Wilson had told him the truth with his whole life. With his openness and his honesty and his willingness to stay even knowing what Hyun's world really was. And Hyun, who prided himself on reading people, on understanding what was real and what was constructed, had looked at a man who was entirely, transparently real, and chosen instead to believe a printed photograph and a practiced performance. He had sent Wilson away. Without a question. Without a word of explanation. Without one moment of fairness. Hyun closed the folder. He sat in the dark for a long time, and for the first time in longer than he could measure, he did not know what to do next. Hyun did not act immediately. That was intentional. He spent 48 hours reviewing everything, not because he doubted the folder but because he needed to understand the full shape of what Rio had built before he took it apart. He went through 11 months of communications, financial movements, operational records. He mapped every thread. He found every seam where Rio had quietly unstitched things. The picture that emerged was complete and damning. Rio had not simply betrayed Moon Corp. He had spent nearly a year constructing its weakening, piece by careful piece, while sitting at Hyun's right hand, attending his meetings, eating his food, speaking at his table. And he had used Wilson, an innocent person who had never had anything to do with any of it, as the instrument to sever the one relationship that might have made Hyun difficult to manipulate. Hyun filed this information in the place in his mind where he kept the things that required permanent resolution. Then, on a Thursday morning, he called Rio into his office. Rio came in looking polished and assured, the way he always had. He sat across the desk with the easy confidence of a man who believed his position was secure. Hyun looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he slid the folder across the desk. He watched Rio's face as Rio opened it. He watched the assurance fracture, slowly then all at once, as Rio read through the pages and understood what he was looking at. Watched the first appearance of something real beneath the performance. A thin, cold thread of fear. Rio tried to speak. Hyun stopped him with one raised hand. "You will not explain?" Hyun said quietly. "There is nothing to explain. I have read everything. I understand everything. We are not going to have a conversation about it." He leaned forward slightly. "You will resign from every position within Moon Corp by close of business today. Your accounts with us are frozen. Every contract, arrangement and connection you have established through this organization is terminated. I have already been in contact with every relevant party." Rio's mouth moved. "I am not finished," Hyun said. "You used someone outside this world, someone who had nothing to do with any of this, to execute a personal agenda. That person lost their home, their education funding, and their relationship because of what you manufactured. That is not a business decision. That is something else entirely. I will remember that distinction." He stood. "Every door in this city that my name can close will be closed to you. This is not a threat. It is simply what is already in motion. You may leave." Rio left. His face as he walked out was the face of a man who understood, finally fully too late, that Hyun Moon's silence was always more dangerous than his anger. Within a week it was done. Rio's access to every financial institution, business network and professional connection with any link to Hyun's world was severed. The messages to the Cheon organization were strategically shared in ways that made Rio a liability to them as well. No one in the city's power structure would take a meeting with him. No legitimate company would hire him. He could not borrow money from anyone who knew his name. It was not violent. It was not loud. It was the kind of end that left no room for recovery or dramatic narrative. Just removal. Total and silent and final. Hyun drove home alone afterward and sat in his empty apartment. The revenge was complete. Rio's fall had been handled correctly. Moon Corp could be repaired. But there was still a blooming flower shop on a side street in Mapo that Hyun could not stop thinking about. And there was still a person who deserved something from him that was much harder to deliver than any professional reckoning. Finding out about still blooming had been an accident. One of Hyun's mid-level associates had ordered a gift arrangement for his wife's birthday through an online service. Nothing to do with business, just a personal errand. The arrangement arrived beautifully made, with a small handwritten note that was warm and specific in a way that felt personal rather than automated. The associate mentioned it to Hyun in passing, showed him the card, mentioned the shop name. Hyun recognized the handwriting. He did not show this recognition to his associate. He nodded and moved on. But that evening, alone, he looked up Still Blooming. He read the website, which was clean and simple and sounded, in its small descriptions of each arrangement, exactly like the way Wilson talked. He found the address. He sat in his car outside the shop for the first time on a Wednesday morning, 11 months after he had sent Wilson away. The shop was small, but it was unmistakably Wilson's. The window display was thoughtful and creative, the kind of arrangement that made a person stop walking and just look for a moment. Through the glass, Hyun could see the interior, warm-lit, carefully organized, flowers everywhere in colors that worked together the way Wilson had always made things work together. He could not see Wilson from the angle he was parked. He sat there for 29 minutes. Then he drove away. He told himself he was ensuring Wilson was stable, that the damage Rio had caused had not left Wilson in genuine hardship. It was a reasonable concern. It was also not entirely the reason he kept coming back. The second visit, he parked closer. The third, he got out of the car and stood on the pavement for a few minutes before getting back in. The fourth, he walked as far as the shop door, put his hand on the handle, stood there for 30 seconds and walked back to the car. He was not afraid of many things in his life. He recognized with uncomfortable precision, afraid of this. He had done something that could not be explained away or resolved with a business decision. He had cut someone off without fairness, without a question asked, and had been wrong to do it. He had no framework for the conversation that needed to happen, no strategic approach, no prepared position. He only had the truth, which felt insufficient and necessary in equal measure. On the fifth visit, he arrived on a quiet Friday morning and parked across the street as usual. Inside the shop, behind the window, Wilson was arranging a tall display of orange and cream flowers, moving with the easy focused energy Hyun remembered. He was wearing his green apron. His natural coil hair was the same. His face in profile was calm. Then Wilson turned toward the window. He saw the car first. Then after a moment he saw Hyun, sitting in the driver's seat, not moving, watching. Wilson looked at him. He did not smile. He did not wave. He did not look angry or hurt or surprised. He looked at Hyun with steady, tired eyes, the eyes of someone who had already done the work of surviving and was not going to perform any emotion for an audience. And then, after a long moment, he simply turned back to his flowers. He went back to arranging. As if saying without a single word, "I see you. But you're going to have to do better than sitting in your car." Hyun looked at the shop window for another minute. Then he got out of the car and walked toward the door. The bell above the door rang. Wilson did not turn around immediately. He finished placing the last stem of the arrangement he was working on, straightened it once, and then turned. Hyun was standing in the doorway of Still Blooming in a long dark coat, hands at his sides, looking at Wilson with an expression that was stripped of the usual professional composure. Not collapsed, not dramatic, just genuinely unguarded in a way Wilson had only seen from him a handful of times. "You can close the door," Wilson said. "It's cold." Hyun closed the door. The shop was quiet. It smelled the way flower shops always smell, like rain and sweetness, the same way petal and thread had smelled on a Tuesday morning what felt like a very long time ago. Wilson leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. Not defensively, just giving himself somewhere to stand. "How long have you been parking outside?" he asked. 5 times, Hyun said. "Over 2 weeks. Wilson nodded slowly. "I know. I saw you the 3rd time." Hyun absorbed this without reaction. "Say what you came to say," Wilson said. His voice was not cold. It was simply level, the voice of someone who had decided they were not going to make this easier or harder than it was. Hyun said it. All of it. He told Wilson about the photos, about Rio, about the manufactured meeting, about Mr. Shin and the folder. He told it plainly, without embellishment, without softening his own part in it. He did not explain away his decision to cut Wilson off without asking questions. He named it clearly as a failure, as something he had no defense for. Then he said, "I was a coward. I did not ask you because I did not want to watch you explain and not believe you. So I chose not to give you the chance. That was wrong. It was completely wrong. And I know that knowing the reason does not repair what it cost you." Wilson was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you know what the worst part was?" Hyun waited. "Not the apartment. Not the school. Not even losing you." Wilson looked at him steadily. "It was that you didn't ask me one question. Not one. After everything, after I told you I would stay, after I told you honesty was the only thing I needed, you looked at something someone else gave you and decided what I was without a single word to me." He paused. "That was the part one couldn't make sense of for a long time." "I know," Hyun said. "I had to make sense of it anyway," Wilson said. Because you weren't there to explain it. So I just built something. He gestured at the shop around him. This. It is good, Hyun said. Quiet. Sincere. I know it is, Wilson said. Not arrogantly. Just honestly. There was a long silence. Hyun stood in it without trying to fill it. I need you to leave, Wilson said finally. Hyun's face moved slightly. Not forever, Wilson said. Just, I need time to think. I'm not going to give you an answer today. I'm not going to give you anything today except this conversation, which I think you deserve to have. He uncrossed his arms. So go. And let me think. Hyun looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, a small, complete nod, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. Wilson. I know, Wilson said before Hyun could speak. Hyun left. Wilson stood in the middle of his shop, in the smell of flowers and the quiet of the morning, and breathed. Hyun did not contact Wilson after leaving the shop. He did exactly what Wilson had asked. He left and he gave Wilson time, and he did not try to accelerate or manage what happened next. For a man who had spent 30 years controlling the variables in every situation, this required a sustained and deliberate effort that surprised him with how difficult it was. What he could do, what fell within the edges of what Wilson had asked, was make sure that Wilson had what he needed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that needed to be acknowledged. The first week after the conversation, a delivery arrived at Still Blooming. A crate of premium wholesale flower stock, varieties that Wilson would have had to source at considerable extra cost through his usual suppliers. No note. An unmarked company name on the shipping label that Wilson would have no reason to connect to anything. But Wilson knew. He stood in the shop doorway looking at the crate for a minute. Then he brought it inside, unpacked it carefully, and put the flowers in water. He did not send a message. The second week, shop packaging materials, the good kind, the kind that made a gift look considered rather than functional, significantly cheaper than what Wilson could source himself. Again, no note. The third week, a small but precise payment arrived in the Still Blooming business account from what appeared to be a corporate client prepaying for a standing order that Wilson had no record of initiating. When he looked at the company name, it was a Moon Corp subsidiary so far downstream that it would take 3 hours of searching to connect it. Wilson spent about 45 minutes before deciding he did not need to spend the other 2 hours 15 minutes. He arranged the week's flowers and did not send a message. Dana watched all of this from the peripheral position of someone who knew Wilson well enough to say nothing while also clearly having many opinions she was storing for later. One evening she simply said while they were making dinner, "You're going to message him eventually." "I know," Wilson said. "Okay," Dana said and changed the subject. Wilson spent the 6 weeks thinking. Not obsessively, not in circles, but the way he thought about real things. He thought about what he wanted. He thought about what he could live with. He thought about the Hyun who had appeared at his shop door with no armor and told the truth without managing it, and how different that had looked from the Hyun he had met on a rainy Tuesday morning who arrived in a fancy car and paid triple for flowers. He thought about what it meant to trust someone who had failed to trust him, and whether trust was a thing that could be rebuilt or only something you could offer fresh each time, knowing it was a risk. He thought about the mornings after Hyun had first cut him off, when getting out of bed had felt like moving through concrete. He thought about the fact that he had done it anyway. That he had built something anyway. That he was okay, genuinely okay, on his own. He thought, I don't need him. But I think I want him. And I think he's trying to be different. And I think different is worth something. On a Sunday evening at the end of the 6th week, Wilson sat at the small desk in the back of his shop, opened his phone and typed a message. Come by Saturday morning. He sent it before he could reconsider. The read receipt appeared in under a minute. Hyun's reply came 4 seconds later. I will be there. Wilson smiled at his phone, not the big wide Atlanta smile, something quieter. Something that felt like the beginning of something careful and chosen and real. He put his phone in his pocket and went back to arranging flowers. Hyun was outside Still Blooming at 6:58 a.m. He had not slept well. He was dressed more simply than Wilson had ever seen him. Dark trousers, a plain gray sweater, no tie. He looked, Wilson thought as he unlocked the shop door, like someone trying to take up less space than usual. You're early, Wilson said. You said Saturday morning, Hyun said. It's 6:58. Morning. Wilson stepped back and let him in. They did not talk about the conversation from 6 weeks ago. They did not talk about Rio or the apartment or any of it. Not that day. That was an unspoken agreement that both of them seemed to understand without discussing. Today was not for more explanation. Today was for something different. Wilson was doing the Saturday morning flower prep. sorting stock, trimming stems, setting up the display cases before the shop opened at 9. He handed Hyun a small pair of floral scissors and a bundle of white roses without explaining much, just said, "Trim about an inch off the bottom of each stem at an angle. Try not to crush them." Hyun looked at the scissors. Then at the roses. With the gravity of a man approaching a complex boardroom negotiation. He made his first cut. It was an imperfect 40-degree angle with slightly too much pressure, and one of the outer petals on the rose detached from the force. Wilson looked at it. Hyun looked at it. "That rose is fine," Hyun said. Wilson pressed his lips together very hard and said nothing. By the 5th rose, Hyun had improved marginally. By the 12th, he was actually getting the angle correct, though he was still treating each stem with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something. Wilson, working quickly and efficiently through his own pile, watched Hyun out of the corner of his eye and felt something warm and almost painfully familiar rise in his chest. "You're doing fine," Wilson said. Hyun looked sideways at him. "You were about to laugh at the first one." "I was not." "You were." "I was being supportive." Hyun made a sound that was almost a short laugh. After the shop opened, they walked to a nearby market and Wilson made Hyun carry the bags. Hyun carried the bags without complaint, which Wilson noted with private amusement. They bought groceries. Back at Wilson's apartment, which was small and warm and full of plants, Wilson started making a simple jollof rice that his mother had taught him and which he had adapted over his time in Seoul. He gave Hyun a task he could not fail, washing the vegetables. Hyun washed the vegetables with complete earnestness. The rice was objectively imperfect. Wilson had misjudged the heat and the bottom layer caught slightly. Hyun ate 2 full bowls without any indication of noticing. When Wilson pointed it out, Hyun said simply, "It tastes right." Wilson looked at him across the small kitchen table and thought, "There you are." They did not define what they were that day. They did not make any promises. They simply were, present with each other, careful in the best way, choosing each small moment deliberately. Hyun laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, when Wilson tried to demonstrate a flower arranging technique by doing it one-handed while explaining the theory, and immediately dropped half the arrangement on the floor. It was the kind of laugh Wilson had heard from him maybe 3 times before. Each time felt like the sun deciding to come out. "I think," Hyun said when the laugh had settled, "that I am better at the trimming." "You are marginally better at the trimming," Wilson agreed. They looked at each other. Outside the apartment window, Seoul went on being loud and large and indifferent. Inside, something small and real and carefully chosen continued, quietly, to grow. The rooftop above Still Blooming had been Wilson's idea. It was not much, a flat concrete space with a low railing, accessed through a door at the top of a narrow staircase that Wilson had permission to use from his landlord. He had put string lights up along the railing and a small rug in the center because the concrete was cold and the view was worth sitting down for. He came up here on slow evenings to think, or to just breathe without anything needing his attention. He had never brought anyone else up here before. He brought Hyun up on a Friday evening, 3 weeks into what they were quietly being to each other, when the city was fully dark and the lights of Seoul spread out below the railing in every direction. Towers and streets and the soft glow of the Han River in the distance, all of it enormous and alive. Hyun stood at the railing and looked at it for a while without speaking. Wilson sat on the rug with his coffee and let him look. He had learned, over the course of knowing Hyun, that silence with Hyun was almost always full of something, never empty, never indifferent. When Hyun went quiet, it meant he was actually somewhere in himself, actually feeling something, actually arriving at something true. So Wilson sat and waited, and let Seoul be big and bright below them, and let the string lights do their simple warm work. Hyun turned from the railing and looked at Wilson. He looked at him the way he had looked at him in that first week at Petal and Thread. The slow, examining look that had, over time, Wilson had come to understand was not cold at all. It was the opposite. It was Hyun paying the most real attention he knew how to pay. "Wilson," Hyun said. Wilson looked up at him. Hyun crossed the small rooftop and sat beside him on the rug. Not an elegant movement, but a real one. He sat the way Wilson had taught him without meaning to, like it was okay to just be somewhere without it being a strategic position. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you," Hyun said. Not as a declaration to a room. Not with the weight of a man making a business decision. Just, quietly. Truthfully. The way people say things when they have stopped managing what they sound like and are simply saying what is real. Wilson looked at him for a long moment. This man. This serious, complicated, extraordinary, difficult man who had arrived in his life dripping water off an expensive suit and had, without either of them intending it, taken up permanent residence in some essential part of Wilson's chest. Who had broken something important and then, slowly, without performance, without any guarantee it would work, shown up and tried. Who was sitting on a concrete rooftop in a gray sweater instead of a gray suit, holding Wilson's gaze like it was the only thing he needed to hold. Wilson thought about Atlanta. About the flower shop and the night school and the boxes on the pavement and the guest house and Dana on the school steps saying you don't beg someone who didn't ask any questions. He thought about every morning he had gotten up anyway, and the shop with his name on it, and the person he had become entirely on his own. He thought, I am good. I am whole. I do not need this. And then, I want this anyway. I choose this. Eyes opened, shadows included, completely. Wilson smiled. The big one. The real one. The wide, easy, unguarded smile that had been on his face on the morning a rainy Tuesday brought a man in a gray suit through a flower shop door. The one that had stopped Hyun cold the very first time he saw it, and never stopped stopping him after that. Then stop being late for things, Wilson said. Hyun looked at him. And then, fully, openly, completely, Hyun laughed. The kind that came from somewhere real. The kind Wilson had learned to treasure like something rare and irreplaceable. The kind that took Hyun Moon's composed, angular, guarded face and made it into something so warm that anyone watching would have had to look twice to believe it was the same person. Wilson laughed with him. Below them, Seoul blazed with 10 million lights. Above them, the string lights glowed their small, steady glow. Between them, something that had been broken and rebuilt and chosen again sat quietly, solidly, beautifully in place. It was enough. It was everything.